Start the stream. Make sure it's working over here. Ba, 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 ba. Great. Okay. Okay. So I looked over the exam, and I realized something. Apparently, the last time I did the exam, because I never taught 101 upstate. So this is, I guess, technically my newest class. Technically, there's a little bit of material from chapter 10 on the final. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's like 4 questions. Now, the bad news in that regard is since I'm doing online classes, it's actually rather difficult to edit the test now, rather than just like, let's just throw these 4 questions off and I'll just find 4 more to throw in there and just even it out. But again, it's 4 questions. And what I did for my Tuesday, Thursday class is we can finish the rest of this chapter easily today. And we'll just very quickly go through the chapter 10 material, and I'll be like, hey, look, this is important, maybe write it down, and then we'll just like go through the slides that don't have notes on them and not worry about it. So yeah, I mean, like literally one of them is the Alamo. Like that's how broad these questions are. So like you don't need to know the names of the people who fought in the Alamo or who like what even caused it. It's just like, hey, there was a fight in southern Texas between Mexico and Spain. Not Mexico and Spain. Mexico and the US. It was the Alamo. Like that's the level of complexity we're dealing with for chapter 10. So yeah, I apologize for that. I should have looked over the exam a little bit earlier, but again, it's very simple stuff. There's, again, 4 questions. One of them is literally the Alamo. Another one is one that you could answer just from any of this other stuff. 2 more, a little bit more specific, but we'll go over it. And it's like, hey, look, this is real important. Maybe write it down. So, FYI, that's what we're going to do today. If we don't get all the way to the end of it today, we'll have time to do that on Monday before the review, because we've always had time to do like a little bit of notes before the review and still have time to do stuff. So again, FYI, in case you forgot, Monday is still review day. We still do come in for a class day on Monday, but for us it's just review day. So don't forget to come in Monday. It's a regular class day technically. Tuesday is reading day, and then I think Wednesday is our exam. It's at 8:30 in here, so for you guys, it's not any different. For my online folks, it's actually still not any different. I'm just going to put the test up like I always do, and you guys need to take care of it as soon as you can. I'm going to leave it up for a few days like I always do, but it's not going to be up as long as usual because I have to get grades in by the next week, so... Other than that, also, again, next Monday is when the paper's due. I don't know if I already said that. I'm trying to get a bunch of stuff at you guys. Yeah, so if you're going to do the second paper, please have it next Monday. Again, for those of you here looking at me, try to hand it in person if you can. It'll make it easier for me to grade. If not, don't worry about it. Email it to me. And obviously, for those of you online, just email it to me. Any questions? Great, let's do the notes and be done with it. Okay. I'm going to get the door just in case it gets noisy outside. Because for some reason, the hallways get loud about 9 a.m. All right, so we went over this last time, the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay, all of that. It's a pretty big deal, especially moving forward into later slavery debates, which we're not going to be able to get to this semester, obviously, with today being like the second to last day of regular classes. So, oh well. It's still important, historically speaking. And there's, the map of where the territory line ended. Where's my mouse? There we go. All right. So, before 1820, the U.S. presidency was largely dominated by Virginia elites. I mean, like, even starting with George Washington, he was from Virginia, and he was like a planter. He was a wealthy landowner. And then after 1800, it was mostly just Democratic Republicans. I mean, they were in power for some 25 years. So for the most part, people didn't really bother with federal elections. They just figured it was always going to go a certain way, so they didn't really even bother with it. It's, an electoral college being what it was. So they mostly dealt with the state and local elections where you actually had a bit more power in your vote. After 1819, when the federal bank was unable to, well, actually not just unable to pull the economy out of the slump that happened, but actively caused said slump, a lot of the public wanted expanded voting rights so that they could force their representatives to actually respond to the public's concerns. So there were a couple of things that happened. For example, in New York State, Martin Van Buren wanted to eliminate property qualifications for voting. Now, this was a big thing. From the start, the Founding Fathers specifically did not want everybody to be able to vote. And this wasn't just like only men can vote. No, only men who had like a certain amount of property, a certain amount of money, a certain amount of prestige. Otherwise, it would be mob rule, and they didn't want that. They didn't want everybody to be able to vote because then you just have riffraff voting, and you couldn't have that. They were still very classist. Like this whole idea of it was a independence movement for the people is not how it really was. So this idea of eliminating property qualifications so that everyone, and by everyone I mean white men, could vote, was a pretty radical change. And again, it's still only white men that were affected by this, so still a small portion of the population, but it expanded voting rights quite a bit, in that people who didn't have the amount of property necessary or even no property at all could now vote. Obviously, this wasn't expanded to other groups. Native Americans and free blacks were, of course, excluded from this expansion of voting rights. You hardly even need to say that because, obviously. We mentioned New Jersey many times before, where the property qualifications in New Jersey allowed for landowning women and free blacks to vote. However, after 1807, when the numbers of the free blacks and women voting actually started to affect close elections, they changed the laws because you can't have that. You can't have elections actually being affected by these small groups of people. So, while New York State did make it so that all white men could vote, they actually made it harder for black men to vote. Basically, there was, the property qualification to vote in New York State. They got rid of it for men, but they raised it. They got rid of it for white men, and they raised it for black men, which basically made it so almost no black men could vote. Obviously, the black men in New York State were very unhappy about this because, it took away their right to vote for no real reason. there was actually a number of whites who sided with them and said that denying rights like this, quote, set an ominous and dangerous precedent. Basically, the laws weren't universal. They were just there arbitrarily, and if you can make laws different for people because of their race, you can make it different for people because you feel like it. It's like, oh, these people are of a political group I don't like. Now we're going to make laws so they can't vote. I mean, it wouldn't be any different than making a law due to a person's race. Now, obviously, the arguments against this were just racist. They didn't want a potential black legislature, or worse, interracial mingling or marriage. Dun, dun, dun. Because, it's the 1800s and can't have that. I mean, hell, I don't know what they would have been. My ex's family, she had cousins that were explicitly, anti-interracial marriage. It's like, really? What century are you living in? It's like, oh, I'm not letting my daughters watch Princess and the Frog because it depicts interracial relationships. It's like, wow, dude. Welcome to the 21st century. Anyway, of course, it being the 1800s, the racism won out, and by 1840, 93% of free blacks were disenfranchised. Which, in 1840, the fact that 7% of free blacks could vote at all was still kind of surprising, considering what happens in the South after the war and all the Jim Crow laws and stuff. So, yeah. Not great. We do have images here of women expressing their right to vote while they still had it. And we'll see some of this next semester as well, during the various pushes for suffrage. But we'll get to that later. And in a segue that unfortunately I will have to use many times, especially next semester, speaking of racism, it got worse. So, besides just restricting voting rights, Congress limited naturalization to immigrants and excluded blacks from joining federal militias, which is to say that the slaves who were freed or otherwise, made into free people were not allowed to become American citizens because they technically weren't immigrants. They were born in America, but they weren't born as citizens because they were born as slaves. But because of the law that only immigrants can be naturalized, they're just random non-citizens that can't become citizens because racism. So various state governments and D.C. were encouraged to create separate legal codes to govern free blacks and slaves, which, again, we'll see next semester, even after the war, because, the South. Segregation of public schools, public transport, public places, Again, this is before the war. This is when that was the norm. And then after the war, it's like, you can't do that anymore. It's like, but what if we do anyway? And the federal government didn't do anything about it. So, mob violence, state section violence, not just random mobs of bigots, but bigots that also ran the government, because the government is run by people. One major event was Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina. Probably somebody important since he's mentioned by name. Hint, hint. Um, they accused him of following Toussaint Louverture's pattern and plotting to free the city slaves. If you don't remember, Toussaint Louverture was the guy who was in charge of the Haiti rebellion. So they basically were accusing him of getting ready to overthrow the government of Charleston, I guess, and, like making a free slave state out of Charleston? Or maybe the whole of South Carolina, I don't know. He was just like a free black person who organized churches, mutual aid societies, and other black institutions, but that was too much power, apparently, for the whites in Charleston. So Vesey and 34 of his alleged co-conspirators were hanged, and 18 more were exiled, which I guess that's kicking them out of Charleston, because the port cities in the South were like one of the only places that were relatively safe for free blacks to go. They also tore down the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where Vesey and his friends often met, because, obviously that was the main gathering place for free blacks in the city. And you can't even have that as like a symbol of these people being murdered for no reason. Now, all that said, this wasn't just something that happened in the South. There was lots of race riots up in the North, many of which didn't make the news, but the ones that did were pretty bad. Cincinnati, there were race riots in 1829. Half of the black residents fled north to Ontario. And in 1832, same thing, African Americans fled from Philadelphia after yet more race riots. And throughout the 1830s, there were, constant attacks against black residents. So it wasn't like the South bad, North good. You just go to the North and everything's fine. It was kind of bad no matter what. Is the door open again? Did I not? Yeah. Okay. So there's Denmark Vesey. And I believe this is Cincinnati, where they're just like burning down the residential areas and chasing the people out of the town. All right, let's discuss something slightly less depressing. And that's politics. Now, part of the reason why this was happening was that the Federalists were basically gone as a political power. After the War of 1812 and the whole, maybe we shouldn't be fighting the British, as the British were... Oh, the door doesn't stay closed, does it? Okay, I'll take care of that. And then the whole, Washington City being burned down thing. They were the only ones who had really been pushing for abolition laws. So once they were no longer in power, it was just the Democratic Republicans. And they didn't care at all what happened to the African Americans. Now, all that said, when it was just the Democratic Republicans in power for near on 25 years, they started to face internal divisions. And it was the same internal divisions that caused the Anti-Federalists to split from the Federalists in the first place, and that was the limits of federal power. Because if you recall, that was what Jefferson ran on to begin with, was we're going to limit federal power. We can't have the government take too much power. It's bad. But as we'd seen, the Democratic Republicans had been embracing federal power quite a bit. Even in the time of Jefferson, the federal government had been using and taking quite a bit of power. Others argued that they should return to the original way of things and limit federal power. So there was this, as I said before, this divide in the party. So in 1824, there was a major divide, which we'll get to in a little bit. And by 1828, this rivalry had finally properly split into two distinct parties, the Democrats and the National Republicans, and we'll get into that in more detail in a moment. In 1824, the race actually had 4 separate candidates. So it wasn't like it split into 2 and then it became a proper split 4 years later. It was a 4-way ticket in 24. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, who was Monroe's Secretary of War. As I told my class yesterday, I've never heard of William Crawford before this, and we don't talk about him again after, so clearly he didn't win. Everybody else is important, though. Adams and Jackson were the front runners. Jackson won the popular vote, and also the support of Martin Van Buren, which becomes important later. However, Henry Clay gave his support to John Adams, so he ended up winning. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams Sr. And he took the presidency due to electoral votes. So apparently, again, winning the most votes doesn't matter because Electoral College. However, due to how close the victory was, John Quincy Adams could only do so much. Congress was led by Van Buren, who, again, ally of Jackson, and his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, actively opposed him. So Adams didn't get a whole lot done. So there wasn't any more federal improvements. No more canals or roads in his presidency. He got 2 things done in the course of his 4 years that made the history books. One, he extended a tariff from 1816, and in 1824, he extended a tariff in 1824, and then in 1828, he made a new tariff for hemp, wool, and molasses, which Jackson actually approved of. And that was it. In fact, the 1828 one is the only, actual original thing he did, which was a tariff on raw materials, which Jackson believed was good for frontier farmers. The election map was all over the place, though. You see here just how it was split. Crawford actually got more electoral votes than Clay. You can see here how New York was split all to pieces. Adams 26, Crawford 5, Clay 4, Jackson 1. Crawford actually got Virginia, which was a hell of a thing, because Virginia was a big get. Which I guess Pennsylvania had grown by that point. It was even bigger. But, there was a lot happening. I like how the state of New York has almost as many votes, electoral votes by itself, as Clay got. It's fun to see, because today it's like what, 244 or something to get the nomination, but here it's like you've only got half the United States, so the numbers are so much smaller. Anyway, this isn't super important because Adams didn't do a whole lot. What's really important is the next election. So with only having like one tariff to his name, Adams went with the traditional approach of standing for office, which is to say not doing anything. In his words, if my country wants my services, she must ask for them. Essentially, he's the incumbent, and the people know what he can do as president, which is to say a tariff. That's it. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren decided to engage in an aggressive run for office, which, again, is much less traditional at that time. I know today it's like, yeah, that's all they do for like 3 years. It's just, that's all you see on TV, and you get tired of it very quickly. But this was, the new and exciting thing was doing a run for office, taking their case to the voters. Van Buren ran the first truly national campaign, tried to recreate the coalition of the Democratic-Republican Party. Jackson was joined by John C. Calhoun as a running mate. I don't know how that works, because John C. Calhoun was Adams' vice president. I guess the vice president can just go and be someone else's running mate if he feels like it. Now, they disagreed on tariffs, which is going to come up later. They organized newspaper campaigns, a logo, which was modeled after Jackson's nickname of Old Hickory from his war hero days / war criminal days. He had a reputation for fighting natives, being from Tennessee, rise to wealth, so he had support among frontier and Southerners. And him supporting the 1828 tariff gave him support in the Northeast. So he did have wide appeal. To try to fight this, Adams supporters just personally attacked Jackson, in particular his wife. Rachel had a suspiciously recent divorce from her previous husband compared to her marriage to Andrew Jackson. Like, she divorced the guy and then married Andrew Jackson not long after. She's like, that smells fishy. Because, politics back then certainly weren't any more civil than they are today. Now, Adams himself stayed out of the mudslinging, trying to remain the gentlemanly statesman, while, of course, not telling his supporters to back off. Because, well, whatever, if they're going to be horrible people, then we'll just let them. Jackson absolutely crushed Adams in the polls. He took every region but New England. And during this campaign, Jackson and his supporters called themselves the Democracy, and Adams supporters named themselves the National Republicans, and this is where we got the names of the parties. Now, this is not the current Democrats and Republicans. They did have a party switch in the mid to late 1900s, 1950, 1960, that sort of thing. Part of Nixon's Southern strategy, but that's a much later story. It's part of the anti-Jackson propaganda. some of the account of the bloody deeds of General Jackson. And this isn't like the natives he's murdered, but like the people who have died under his command, which is probably not untrue. But this is how it ended up going. Pretty one-sided. It gets worse in later electoral maps. We'll see a lot more of these electoral maps next semester. Some of them are really one-sided. Another bit of propaganda. There's a lot of this. A lot of people dislike Jackson. This is going to come up. This is the nullification crisis with South Carolina. We caused an almost civil war earlier than the actual civil war we caused, but we'll get to that. So, crowds of regular folk poured into Jackson's inauguration to see their hero. There's a picture in the book. I'll have it appear in a minute. But the caption under the picture says, "The crowds of ordinary people were so enthusiastic and unrestrained that President Jackson had to flee out the back of the White House to escape injury." Jackson's wife Rachel had died less than 3 months earlier, so Jackson was not really in high spirits for this. Dressed in a plain black suit, walked alone to the Capitol, and as fast throng of supporters waved and cheered. Shattered decorum. Mobs of scrambling, fighting, and romping through the White House. Jackson was nearly crushed to death by rabble eager to shake his hands. Tubs of punch laced with rum, brandy, and champagne were finally placed on the lawn to draw the crowds outdoors. Yeah, it was a bit of a party, and this concerned the more conservative political leaders. They saw these masses as dangerous because, once again, as I said, going back to the original founding fathers, this idea of the rule by the masses was seen as not something you wanted. And this was seen literally, physically at Jackson's inauguration. Also, Jackson had some scandals like right away as he entered office. Petticoat affair. Basically, one of his picks for his cabinet, John Eaton, Secretary of War. Essentially, Eaton had an affair with a woman thought to be of questionable character. I don't know. Whatever. And then married her, and so the political wives in Washington snubbed her at social gatherings, so he had to drop out of being Secretary of War, apparently. Which apparently caused such a big scandal that the rest of Jackson's cabinet had to resign, and thus gave the National Republicans more power in Congress. I don't know how all of that made that happen, but I don't know. It's not the 1840s. I mean, in a time when, like, you've got people stomping around the White House, and it's like, let's put bowls of punch in the front lawn full of alcohol to get them back outside. In an era where that's normal, that, like, one of the dudes that Jackson selected as Secretary of War happened to marry a woman that was questionable was enough that the whole cabinet had to resign. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, who cares? There were concerns that Jackson had been using his authority to reward his friends, which, I mean, is just how things are in the government now. But Jackson didn't really use his official cabinet anyway. Relied on an informal group of advisors known as the Kitchen Cabinet. This was a name used by his opponents. Rather than his official cabinet anyway. It's just like a group of friends that he would talk to and get advice from. But bringing personal friends in and giving them positions of power became known as a spoils system. So, giving people who have absolutely no business in the government positions of power in the government is a thing that apparently is still in the government for some reason. I don't know. Also, this is the picture that's in the book. The people just like having a party. I mean, these people are about to get creamed by that horse. So point on the thing for the folks. I mean, that foot is about to break some skulls. Also, they've got a dog, so it's okay. And there's what's her face for the petticoat affair, and there's some people fighting about it. Couldn't find a whole lot on that. And Jackson's kitchen cabinet. Excuse me. Okay. Less scandals and more just like the stuff that Jackson got up to, or stuff going on while Jackson was in power. I guess this one wasn't really entirely his fault. So as we mentioned, people in his administration disagreed over tariffs. I mean, John C. Calhoun in particular. So Southern politicians and, frontier folks as well expected Jackson to repeal the tariff of 1828, but the folks in the North wanted him to keep it. So either way, he was going to piss somebody off. So when Jackson sort of sat on his hands about it, his vice president, John C. Calhoun, once again, South Carolina native, anonymously wrote in this South Carolina exposition in protest because, I don't know how many South Carolinians there were in the White House at the time, but real anonymous, good work, Calhoun, suggested that states had the ultimate power in deciding the constitutionality of laws. Oh boy. So this idea was called nullification, or to put it more simply, a state ignoring a federal law. If a state doesn't like a law, it can just ignore it. If the federal government says the federal speed limit is 70, and Texas says no, it's 120, Texas can just say it's 120. It basically makes the federal government pointless, because if the states can just ignore a federal law, then what's the point of the federal government? So South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne defended nullification, claiming it would be used to economically crush the South. Daniel Webster opposed nullification because, again, if states can just ignore a law, then what's the point? Afterward, Jackson supported Webster, again, essentially saying that, I've got a quote from Jackson. We'll get to that in a minute. So Jackson signed a tariff into law, the 1832 tariff. South Carolina held a convention that approved the ordinance of nullification and prepared for a civil war, essentially. Nothing ever really came of it. Not yet. We'll have our little war later. But we were ready for a war like 30 years early. Jackson had another issue to deal with, and that was the Bank of the United States. So that was always an issue with the Democratic Republicans as well. If you recall from way back at the start with Jefferson again, he didn't like the idea of the National Bank, or the Bank of the United States, But once it was created, they rechartered the Second Bank of the United States because it helped to keep things stable. However, with the whole Panic of 1819, people are thinking it's maybe not such a good idea anymore. So long story short, it needs to be rechartered again. His opponents expected Jackson to veto it, and that it would split the party and weaken Jackson. Now again, as we mentioned, it had helped to stabilize the economy, but also regular folk didn't like it, merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs did, so it was a toss-up. Jackson did end up vetoing the charter, and a lot of people ended up supporting him. A lot of folks said it was, quote, dangerous to the liberties of the people. So he did what people expected him to do, and there wasn't the backlash that was expected. So that's the whole thing. And I've got again, there's an image in the book that I've got like a sticky note on from years back of him fighting the bank. I'll show you guys in a minute. I've got that image as well. Anyway, here's Jackson about the nullification thing. I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state, incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressively by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, and consistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. Because, South Carolina's just like, oh, if you just let us do this one thing, it'll be fine. It's like, no, if we let South Carolina do this one thing, then all the other states would technically be able to do it because you got to be fair. And if all states can annul a law, then what's the point of the federal government? Also, while I was looking for images for the nullification crisis, for some reason I found this, and I was like, I've got to include it. So there you go. And this was about the bank for some reason. King Andrew I. People were very concerned with the amount of power that he had. But they're like, is him destroying the Constitution, despite most of the stuff he did was very popular? I don't know. Speaking of which, and I don't know if you're ready for this, here he is fighting the bank. The bank was this weird Hydra thing. So yeah, that's a thing that exists. There's a color version of it in the book, if you want to see that monstrosity. Right. Now on to the thing that he's most well known for, and that's doing some genocide. So to gain support with the Southerners, they wanted some native land. And the best way to get native land is to do a lot of native murder. Now, not everybody agreed with this. Obviously, some folks were like, maybe we shouldn't murder these people we've been murdering for the last several centuries. The folks that disagreed were usually Protestant missionaries who wanted to civilize the natives, which is to say, destroying their culture anyway. But I guess the people still being alive is better than not. Which, I don't know, they tried to civilize the First Nations up in Canada and still ended up murdering a lot of them. So that was a whole thing. James Monroe, John Quincy Adams tend to support the rights of the natives, as long as they embraced the missionary skulls. Obviously, Jackson wanted to force the natives west of the Mississippi because he wanted what the planters wanted. Now, as we mentioned last time at the War of 1812, the Cherokees had fought alongside Andrew Jackson. And seemingly knowing what was coming, had adopted a Republican form of government and elected John Ross as president. So rather than preparing to go to military conflict with the United States, because they recognized how strong, I guess, the U.S. military had become, they were ready to go to war with the United States in the courtroom. They declared themselves a sovereign nation within the U.S., and while the Georgia legislature rejected this initially, they did bring this all the way to the Supreme Court, and they had some wins. It went back and forth. We'll get more into that a little bit later, but John Ross managed to hold on to things for a long time. Eventually, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Natives had to exchange their ancestral lands for land west of Mississippi. Basically, it's a bunch of land in, was it Arkansas? Oklahoma. He sent federal troops to remove the Sauk Sioux natives and Fox natives from western Illinois. Slaughter of Chief Blackhawk and his warriors at Bad Axe was not even really a battle. I've got an image of that one as well. Meanwhile, the Seminole natives in Florida prepared for a good old traditional stand-up fight, and they would hold on for a while. While, as I mentioned, John Ross was going to fight in the legal system. And while both sides end up not being victorious in the end, they did hold on longer than most groups. So here's our boy John Ross and the various tribes as they're sent to what would become Oklahoma, and then eventually squeezed into this tiny corner. Because, Americans like to murder people that aren't like them. Here's the so-called battle. Some dudes on a raft versus a cannon on a steamboat. Not really a fair battle. Here's some more one-sided fighting. The natives have a couple of guns. All right, so for this chapter, the War of 1812, not just dangerous because, our capital got burned down, but it caused a split within the government briefly, which only really resulted in the Federalists basically losing all their power. Panic of 1819, causing concerns over banks and tariffs. Mission, Missouri, causing greater struggle over slavery. Henry Clay being the voice of compromise. He also supported John Ross's opposition to the Indian Removal Act. John Quincy Adams, as we mentioned, Democrat-Republican Party had split. And Andrew Jackson driving out the natives, changing the presidency, and setting new standards, which will continue on, for better or worse, for quite some time. All right, we still got a bit of time yet. Actually, and since I showed that longer Erie Canal video to my class yesterday, we've actually going to be able to get a little bit further than I did in my Tuesday, Thursday class. So we're going to be ahead of them for once. All right, let's get into Chapter 10 and just briefly go over what's important. All right. Chapter 10, Slavery Expands South and West. This one is not important. Excuse me. It's just that the whole like big plantations that we're used to thinking about, excuse me, didn't really happen until the 1840s. Oh, and then there's this asshole. I think that I may safely conclude, and I firmly believe, that American slavery is not only not a sin, but especially commanded by God through Moses and approved by Christ through his apostles. What the hell, dude? Yeah, James Henry Hammond. He had a unique perspective. All right. Urban life, there wasn't much of it. Tratagar is pretty cool. Actually, let's just go ahead. That's Tratagar. It was a big ironworks in Tennessee, Richmond, Virginia. Yeah. There were a couple of cities, Charleston, Baltimore, Savannah, etc. We didn't have much when it came to cities. As I mentioned, cities were mostly were really the only place free blacks could go for any level of safety in the South. There's Charleston there. However, this presence of free blacks and immigrants made it so that most like white planters wouldn't go, which again made it better for the free blacks. So all the better. Not much in terms of urban development, so hardly any roads, no kind of railroads, no kind of canals. Anything here? Not really. Manual labor, so again, not really any kind of technological advancement because slavery was really all they had and that's all they wanted. So rather than improving the tools and techniques, they just brought in more slaves. Here's one. By 1860, cotton accounted for nearly 2/3 of the U.S. export trade. That's a fact that I've been throwing at you guys a bunch, but here it actually is in the notes. That was a thing that I said you guys could have answered just from stuff that I've been telling you before, but here it actually is now on the board. Yeah, due to the slave trade and cotton, it affected the entire economy, not just the South, but the whole nation. I'm going to completely close the door because the hallway is loud. Okay. So, that's the first important bit. Let's see. And you've got your families here. Images of folks out in the fields. Oh, yeah, the syncretic culture. That's pretty cool. Basically, this combining of African, Caribbean, and American cultures. Specifically, what I took from this was the Gullah dialect that combined African words and speech patterns with English. It's still used in some sea islands here in the Carolinas today. So, hey, I think that's interesting, therefore it's probably important. Other syncretic culture things were, again, religious practices, which is something I've talked about a bunch before, but we've not used the term syncretic culture, which again is just combining different ideas and practices together. Do I have? Oh, I did. I'm dumb. I had the the thing here the whole time, and I didn't even look at it. All right. There again, you got. I love now that we're moving into the 1800s. We've got actual photographs, and that's always a more true look into the lives of people. And I think this is specifically a sea island off of South Carolina here. Also, you have these packed churches. First African Church, Richmond, Virginia. Resistance and Rebellion. We've seen some of this already. Specifically, though, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Hint, hint. Nat Turner began a revolt in Virginia. He and his followers killed their owners and family, began recruiting other slaves, killed 57 men, women, and children, freed more than 50 slaves. Militia caught up with them. Turner hid out for more than 2 months before he was captured, tried, and executed on November 5th, along with 55 other African Americans. And then mobs beat, tortured, and killed more than 200 blacks that had no connection to the rebellion at all, because how dare you even think about being freed? So we've got the various methods of resistance, and then Nat Turner's Rebellion. Again, children not being drawn to scale. Slave insurrections. Which only made things worse. Some of Virginia started to question the institution of slavery, especially in the West, because slavery wasn't profitable. That's why we eventually got Western Virginia, or West Virginia. Thomas Dew argued slavery was for the good of the slaves, because of course. None of this is actually especially important for the test, so we're going to move right along. There's this horrible thing. Slavery is a national sin, says Satan, therefore it's a lie. There's that horrible racist caricature. Now, a lot of white southern farmers did not have slaves. Yeoman farmers, they had landowners. They were landowners, they didn't have slaves, and then there were a lot of southerners who didn't have land. They just moved from place to place, hunted, fished, or just like worked for whoever needed an extra hand. So there's your typical yeoman farmer. And of course, laws being what they were, they didn't vote because they didn't have land. And then there's your like middle class family. All right, we're almost there. All right. So with these various countries emancipating their slaves, like Britain and France, and then the many Hispanic countries that are throwing off Spanish rule and then immediately declaring emancipation. In the United States, there's various groups that are trying to keep the poor whites from siding with, the slaves. So you had folks like Thomas Dew that we saw last time, say that, oh, well, you know, even if you're a poor white, you're still superior to, you know, the blacks because, you know, racism. Um, to try to keep an interracial coalition from happening. You still, though, had the Quakers who would body block folks to help slaves gain their freedom. I do like this image. All right, if we can get a little bit further, we can go ahead and knock out the last thing, and then we will probably be able to finish early on Monday. So let's go ahead and get this done over with. There was Second Seminole War. That actually ended up long after Jackson ended his presidency. It wasn't until the chief was lured into an army camp with false promises of peace, only to be taken captive, because we Americans are real good at that. There's John Ross again. Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. Supreme Court ruled the native tribes were domestic dependent nations. Was later overturned. Treaty of New Echota. Small group of Native men agreed, the Cherokee Nation. However, Congress approved the treaty, so the Cherokee were forced to move west in the Trail of Tears, where many were killed by starvation and disease, because it took them 5 months to be forcibly marched, from Georgia to what's essentially Oklahoma. So there's the Seminole War. More of that. There was a lot of fighting down in Florida. There's our boy John Ross again. And the Trail of Tears, which this is similar to the one we saw before. All right, let's get on to the Battle of Texas. Mexico's going through Spanish rule. They gave the U.S. migrants some land in eastern Texas because the Comanche natives were giving Mexico a hard time, plain and simple. And they did let the U.S. planters bring slaves in because they knew the U.S. planters wanted to bring slaves in, even though Mexico had outlawed slavery, just to bring in more slaves. I'm bringing more Americans for the sake of that buffer zone. There was a Mexican culture. That one's actually not super important for this. However, the Americans soon began outnumbering the Mexicans in that region, and then started demanding independence in a region that was granted to them by Mexico so that they could, help the area out. Eventually, there was a nationalist leader, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who wanted to curb American settlers who wanted more concessions, which eventually led to a rebellion, declared eastern Texas independent, which eventually led to the Alamo. There it is. March 6, 1836, General Santa Anna crushed the settlers defending the fort, killing the men but freeing the women and children. The U.S. technically claimed neutrality because this whole thing was just like an independent rebellion. Many Americans did go to help, led by General Sam Houston, who himself pushed the Mexican forces back. And due to what this was going to cause, they passed a rule to table any anti-slavery talks to avoid bringing Texas into the Union, because it was an election year and they knew where that was going to go. So, there's the Alamo. And there's the Tejanos. There's General Santa Anna. And the Alamo. And General, where are we at? Sam Houston. Yeah, there we go. All right, that's it. Y'all can go. This is up on Blackboard. I mean, we've still got like a couple of slides left, but we're not going to worry about those. That's it for the exam. I will see you guys on Monday. It's review day, and also when the papers are due. So come in for Monday. And also for you online folks, that's also going to be review day. So remember that. Okay, bye.